From Thom Hartmann's Daily Take Substack. Germans, Hungarians, Russians, Italians all waited until it was too late. Are Americans about to join that tragic club? Step by step, MAGA is normalizing repression and setting America up for tyranny. Will we wait, like so many before us, until the knock comes to our own door? Published June 10th, 2025. The following is a song inspired by this article.
It didn't start with tanks or flame, no banners torn, no cities claimed, just a paper sign in a quiet room. A new law passed, a new costume, no siren scream, no rifles cracked, just silence loud enough to distract. A neighbor gone, a story missed, a hand unraised, a clenched white fist. This is how it ends, not with a roar, but with a shrug. One rule bent, one truth unplugged. No need for boots to break the line. Democracy dies one silent step at a time. A headline shifts, a phrase is banned, a speech erased, a trembling hand. The judge retires, the vote is rigged, the lie grows bold, the truth grows big. They say it's temporary, it's just a test. It's not ideal, but it's for the best. And so the people fold and fade, their courage bartered, their freedom laid. This is how it ends, not all at once, but piece by piece, with whispered fear and stage police. 1,000 cuts, no single crime. Democracy dies one silent step at a time. You think you'll stand when it gets bad, but by then you've lost what you once had. No line to cross, no call to make, no judge to hear, no breath to take. The mask was velvet, the voice was sweet, it bowed to you before the beat. And by the time the jaws were shown, you found yourself already owned. This is how it ends, with claps and chants and marching bands, with laws that bind instead of hands. We traded truth for party lines and watched it die one silent step at a time. So when the silence feels too still and justice bends against its will, speak now or be the warning sign. This is how democracies die, one silent step at a time.
Quote, "The fog crept in on little cat feet," end quote. Carl Sandburg, Fog, 1916. Eventually, people in countries that are in the process of flipping from democracy to fascism figure out that they're now living in a dictatorship. By then, however, it's usually too late. For people in Hungary, it was May 2020 when Orban started arresting people for their Facebook posts. For folks in Russia, it was when Navalny and his supporters were first assaulted in public and then arrested and sent to brutal gulags in Siberia. For Germans, it was July 14, 1933, 6 months after he had become chancellor, when Hitler outlawed all political parties except his own. But at first, the steps from democracy to fascism and tyranny always seems like, quote, just another thing the government has to do to deal with the very real problem, end quote. Something that reasonable people would understand and can't reasonably object to. Something that, even if weird, makes a certain amount of sense. Until suddenly the mask is dropped and the twisted face of hateful fascism peers out at the country with laser red eyes and a bloody mouth filled with threats and lies. Wearing camouflage, face masked, carrying handcuffs. We're there. Trump and his neo-fascist enablers started with quiet cat's feet. Now they're holding a rifle and using a bullhorn. How do we know that Trump is doing something very different from America's past, something that inevitably leads somewhere other than democracy? During the first 3 months of President Obama's presidency, he deported 63,257 people for being in the country without documentation. Trump's first 3 months of 2025 saw roughly 61,060 deportations. Why is Trump getting headlines and protesters with his arrests and deportations while Obama didn't, even though he deported even more people than Trump has? Because, for Trump, this isn't about deportation or purging the nation of, quote, illegals, end quote. Instead, it's about making Americans comfortable with authoritarian police state tactics. The immigrants are just props, albeit ones that appeal to the racist mega base. Obama deported people because based on so-called Morton memos, also known as, quote, enforcement priority memos, end quote, which required ICE to focus entirely on those undocumented aliens who posed either, quote, national security, end quote, or, quote, criminal, end quote, threats to America. While those arrested and immediately turned back at the border didn't get a day in court, the people Obama targeted within the U.S. were detained after warrants were issued based on probable cause they had committed a crime or were a threat to America, as the Bill of Rights in U.S. law requires, and each had their day in court where they could claim that they'd been arrested and held without legal justification. Obama also started Operation Crosscheck, organizing coordinated raids across the country, targeting aliens with established criminal records, and each arrest required proper legal documentation or warrants. He also operated his immigration enforcement efforts equally well in red states as in blue states. The Biden administration also largely followed the legal structures, court hearings, due process, and enforcement priorities established under Obama. But under Trump, in complete defiance of the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendment of the Constitution, ICE officers are arresting people without warrants and imprisoning or deporting them without an opportunity to contest their detention or removal from the country in a court of law. Why would Trump do this when both Obama and Biden were able to deport as many or more while simply following the law? Why has Trump put the National Guard and Marines in our streets with their guns turned on American citizens? Why is Trump having federal police carry out high-profile raids in schools, hospitals, workplaces, and courthouses, rather than simply showing up at people's homes after hours and quietly detaining them like Obama and Biden did without all the fanfare? Why all this military theater? Why is our Secretary of Homeland Security dressing up like an immigration agent to cosplay for the cameras, with the resulting videos being plastered all over social media? Why is Trump giving a highly political banana republic-style speech to active duty soldiers, attacking the previous president and the governor of California with lies and partisan slurs, and none of the leaders of our military stepped in to point out what a violation it was of apolitical American military policy and tradition going back to George Washington? Because it's really not at all about undocumented aliens or deportation. Instead, it's all fascism theater designed specifically and intentionally to get us ready to accept what's next. First, you see, they turn their guns and their violations of culture and religious or legal norms on the weakest and most misunderstood or even hated people in society. For Hitler, that was trans people and immigrants. For Mussolini, it was labor leaders and immigrants. For Putin, it was rebelling Chechens and immigrants. For Orban, it was Roma people and immigrants. In each case, quote, regular citizens, end quote, quickly got used to police kicking in other people's doors without warrants, throwing, quote, undesirables, end quote, in prison, without attorneys or court proceedings, and having masked out-of-uniform, quote, officers, end quote, dragging folks off the streets without identification or justification. After all, it was only, quote, them, end quote, who were targeted. At the same time, each of these regimes began extensive intelligence gathering operations to identify actual or even potential dissidents and ways they could be broken, either through exposing secrets like homosexuality or affairs, by bankrupting them with libel suits for speaking against the administration, or even outright arrest on trumped-up sedition charges. Think Doge's pimply-faced incels downloading every single bit of data the government has ever had on you and aggregating it into a massive database this administration can use against you when the time comes. Next, wannabe dictators always open huge detention/prison facilities with the rationalization that they were for, quote, those people, end quote, the immigrants, Jews, gypsies, protesters, and communists, like Trump is doing right now with the multi-billion-dollar private prison contracts he just signed, and Trump's reopening Guantanamo offshore military prison. And then, of course, in each case throughout history, the regime's police, paramilitaries, and ultimately the military itself turn their guns and their new prisons on those same, quote, regular people, end quote, who dared speak up, who challenged them politically, or who outed their crimes and corruption. The first and most important key is always to get the police and the military on the wannabe dictator's side, so there'll be no resistance when the hammer drops. Thus, yesterday, Trump spoke to troops at Fort Bragg, telling them how he was going to bring back the names of Confederate generals to American military facilities, even though those racist, slavery-defending men had launched a murderous war against the United States. Quote, for little breaking news, we are going to be restoring the names to Fort Pickett, Fort Hood, Fort Gordon, Fort Rucker, Fort Polk, Fort A.P. Hill, and Fort Robert E. Lee, end quote, Trump said, as the soldiers cheered wildly at the name of the traitor, Robert E. Lee, who killed more Americans than Hitler or any other single foreign enemy in history. Then he turned to the news media, and in front of these men and women who we have trained to use military arms to kill people, proclaimed to loud boos from the crowd, quote, and for a little news for the fake news back there. The fake news, ladies and gentlemen, look at them. Look at them all. What I have to put up with. Fake news, end quote. Author of Third Reich of Dreams, Charlotte Brent, lived through the rise of Nazis in Germany. She wrote, quote, the Nazi official who remarked that people had a private life under the Third Reich only while they were asleep actually underestimated the dictator's prowess, end quote. The data genius, the Elon Musk Doge of Germany in the 1930s, was IBM. They organized and kept the data on every German who was Jewish, gay, socialist, or otherwise offended the Nazi regime. And now comes the beginning of the final stage, much like Hitler opened Dachau on March 22nd, 1933, a mere 3 months before becoming chancellor, with the announcement in yesterday's Washington Post. Quote, the Trump administration is preparing to begin the transfer of potentially thousands of foreigners who are in the United States illegally to the U.S. military base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, starting as early as this week, said U.S. officials familiar with the matter, end quote. Yes, this is an old movie the world has seen several times throughout history. That's why Europe's leaders are so freaked out about Trump right now. Back in the early 1950s, Germans who lived through the Nazi era warned Chicago journalist Milton Meyer that they had, quote, become used to being governed by surprise, end quote, and told him how each step toward Hitler's eventual tyranny was incremental. As a college professor told Meyer, quote, you see, one doesn't exactly see where or how to move. Believe me, this is true. Each act, each occasion is worse than the last, but only a little worse. You wait for the next, and the next. You wait for the one great shocking occasion, thinking that others, when such a shock comes, will join you in resisting somehow. You don't want to act, or even to talk alone. You don't want to go out of your way and make trouble. Why not? Well, you're not in the habit of doing it. And it is just not just fear of standing alone that restrains you. It is also genuine uncertainty. Uncertainty is a very important factor, and instead of it decreasing as time goes on, it grows. Step C is not much worse than Step B, and if you did not make a stand at Step B, then why should you at Step C, and so on to Step D, end quote. We're already far down that road, step by step into MAGA tyranny, utterly destroying American democracy. Will we finally draw a line and stop this violent, armed juggernaut? Or will we, like the Germans, Hungarians, Italians, Russians, Turks, Egyptians, and so many others, wait to act until the repression is so obvious it's undeniable and unstoppable? The choice, at least for so far, is still ours.